Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us today to discuss new developments in the landmark Mathur and Ontario climate case. My name is Julia Kroom. I'm the Director of Litigation Practice at Ecojustice, Canada's largest environmental law charity, and one of the lawyers for the youth applicants on this case. I'll be moderating the press conference this morning. I'm joining you from traditional territories of several First Nations, the Huron-Wendat, the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Chippewas, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. As many of you know, just 3 weeks ahead of a critical December 1st hearing, where the Ford government was expected to have to answer for its climate record, the province revealed plans to quietly remove key sections of the Cap and Trade Cancellation Act in its fall economic statement. This includes removing the statutory requirements that Ontario set greenhouse gas emissions reductions targets, prepare a climate plan, and issue regular progress reports. Yesterday, after limiting debate, the government passed these changes into law. As a result of this last-minute development, the hearing scheduled for December 1st and 2nd next week has been adjourned while the parties in the courts determine next steps and assess the implications of the government's proposed legislative changes. We'll be hearing from 6 speakers today, including representatives from Ecojustice, Stockwoods, LLP, the Canadian Association for Physicians for the Environment, Greenpeace Canada, and 2 of the youth applicants at the helm of the Mathur litigation, about what this latest development means for this case and the Ford government's broader trend of avoiding climate accountability. We'll then move into the question period. A few housekeeping items before we begin. Please change your Zoom name to include your name and outlet, which will help us take questions and follow up with you after the call. Throughout the conference, please send your questions in the chat to hosts and panelists. After our speaker remarks, we will be fielding your questions and aim to get through as many as possible. If you have any technical difficulties, please reach out to hosts and panelists in the Zoom chat for support. With that, we're ready to hear from some of the individuals behind this case. First up, Fraser Thomson from Ecojustice.
Good morning. My name is Fraser Thomson. I'm an Ecojustice lawyer who's been working with our clients on this case since its inception. Exactly 6 years ago, on November 26, 2019, our clients announced that they had launched a groundbreaking charter case challenging the Ontario government's climate target and actions. The case rests on a simple but powerful premise. When government actions that drive climate change and threaten our lives and health violate our charter-protected rights, the courts have a duty to step in. For Ontarians, Canadians, and people around the world, this case and cases like it have been a beacon of hope in a world plagued with government indifference to the growing climate catastrophe. Despite numerous attempts over the last 6 years by the Ford government to have it kicked out of court, this case has made legal history at every turn. It was the first case to rule that charter climate litigation is justiciable before the courts, and it was the first charter climate case to ever be heard on its merits. It was also the first case to affirm what the science has been telling us for years, that the climate crisis is risking the lives and well-being of countless Ontarians, and that this risk is fueled by Ontario's failure to reduce its emissions. Most recently, the highest court in Ontario affirmed many of these findings and ruled that when governments set climate targets, they must adhere to the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. The Court of Appeal's October 2024 ruling set the stage for a crucial hearing that had been scheduled for next week. The established law and factual findings had boxed the government into a corner, and with the law and all the momentum behind them, the youth at the helm of this case were optimistic that the government would finally be held to account. Disappointingly, although perhaps not surprisingly, the Ford government has yet again chosen to pull out all the stops to avoid accountability. Rather than tackling the real threat, the climate crisis, they're focused on saving face. Less than a week before this scheduled hearing, the Ford government has fast-tracked a repeal of the legislation that had obligated them to set a greenhouse gas emissions target and plan, and which had featured prominently in the Court of Appeal's reasoning. It's really hard to see this as anything other than a clear attempt by the Ford government to skirt accountability for its climate record. Now, as Julia alluded to, many of you may be wondering what this means for the case. Well, in light of the Ford government's most recent rollback, the hearing scheduled for December 1st and 2nd has been adjourned so that the parties can agree on next steps. Given the uncertainty that could have arisen at a hearing as a result of this last-minute change, our clients have agreed to a brief adjournment and will be proposing a schedule for getting back before the courts as soon as possible. Like its previous failed attempts to have this case thrown out of court, we strongly believe that this most recent attempt by the Ford government will not work. If anything, these last-minute tactics make the youth even more committed to climate justice. They will continue their fight to ensure that all Ontarians, especially young people and especially Indigenous youth, have a right to a safe climate. When the courts and the science are clearly showing that Ontario drastically needs to reduce its emissions to ensure our most fundamental rights, burying our heads in the sand is not an option. Not when the consequences are so serious and not when the very future of our planet is at stake. Thank you.
Thank you, Fraser. Next, I'll pass the mic to two of the youth applicants behind this case, starting with Madison Dyck.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks, Fraser. My name is Madison Dyck. 6 years ago, I joined 6 incredibly caring, brave, and dedicated young people in launching this case. In many ways, the 7 of us have grown up together as this case has made its way through the courts. Throughout that time, many of us have graduated high school, started careers, begun and finished university, and are even thinking about starting families of our own. All the while, we've remained committed to this fight. My motivations for joining this case were simple. They came from a deep love for Lake Superior, the place that has shaped my life and my community. But over these same 6 years, while Alex, Beezy, Shay, Shelby, Sophia, Zoe, and I were growing up, and our lives are changing, the impacts of climate change are changing too, and not for the better. In Northern Ontario, I've witnessed how the spring melt is reshaping our way of life, how the changing climate is disrupting fish spawns and impacting the habitats that our community and cultures depend on, notably not being able to skate on outdoor rinks in the winter. I've watched erratic and unpredictable weather become the new normal, from sudden heat waves to torrential rain. Across the region, forest fires are threatening and destroying huge swaths of the boreal forest where I live and work. Since joining this case, I've experienced the reality of the climate emergency firsthand. Breathing heavy wildfire smoke, preparing emergency evacuation plans, and living with the constant awareness the environment that nurtured me as a child is no longer stable. And that's why I turned to the courts. And that's why I'm so proud of everything our case has accomplished so far, and everything it will continue to accomplish. Because of this case, every government in Canada has been put on notice. We will not let them keep getting away with fueling the climate crisis and disregarding our futures. While I had hoped for accountability from my government, I can't say I'm surprised by this latest tactic to silence our voices and sideline our concerns. The Ford government has tried to have this case thrown out multiple times, but every single time they have failed. Despite our province's most recent attempt to stop us, we are confident we will get our day in court and that our case will hold the Ford government to account for its climate record. The government might be afraid of the truth, but we're not. We believe that it's only a matter of time before the Ontario government will have to confront the 7 of us in court and finally face the music for its shameful record. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. Next, I'll pass the mic to another youth applicant spearheading this case, Shaelyn Wabegijig.
Miigwech. Kwekwe animbojo gje wadaze ogechidai kwe indigenicas atikindodem minjikning and donjaba timiskming edabindagos nibising in da. Hi everyone, my name is Shaelyn Wabegijig. I'm here today representing my fellow applicants in this case and so many young people across the province because we're already living with the impacts of the climate crisis and we worry every day about the future that we're being left with. I see the way the world around me is rapidly changing. I hear from the elders about how things used to be and grieve what we've already lost. But that grief fuels my determination to take action for the generations on their way. I'm here because the court has already found that Ontario's 2030 climate target was inadequate. Instead of fixing it, the Ford government tried to run away from its responsibility entirely by removing the law that requiring them to set targets at all. If the courts have said that this government needs to do more, we believe they should not be allowed to get away with doing less. I have said before, and I say again, I'm certain that the Ontario government is aware of the devastating realities of the climate crisis. They have a responsibility to us, the people they serve. They must listen to the land, the science, Indigenous peoples, and young people, and the courts. All of these voices are speaking the same truth. I have a responsibility to protect the sacred land and waters that nourishes us and should nourish our children and grandchildren. This responsibility is older than any government. It comes from the land. I am proud to be part of this work, and I look forward to our day in court. Because accountability matters, the land matters, our future matters. We deserve a government that faces the truth of the climate crisis, not one that runs from it. We deserve a safe and livable future, and we will continue this fight until we get it. Miigwech.
Thank you, Shay. Next up is Nader Hasan of Stockwoods LLP. Nader is lead counsel on this case, a seasoned constitutional litigator, and recognized as one of the best appellate litigators in Canada.
Thank you, Julia. Good morning, everyone. Our message today is really simple. The Ford government is trying to run from its climate obligations and from the courts, but our clients will not let them. As you've heard from Maddie and Shay, these young people brought this case because climate change is already threatening their lives, their health, and their futures. Their motivations are deeply rooted in their lived experience and also in the overwhelming scientific consensus showing that we are running out of time to take action. The science is abundantly clear, and the courts in this province have already adjudicated the facts. Ontarians face increased risk of death and serious health risks from climate change, and the government's action is contributing to that harm. Any responsible government would treat this threat with urgency. Yet here we are today. Instead of listening to its citizens and listening to the courts, the Ford government has once again stepped backwards, gutting its own climate targets and repealing its own legislation just weeks before facing judicial scrutiny. It's obvious what's happening here. After losing at the Court of Appeal, the Ford government was due back in court on December 1 to answer for its climate record. And now, at the last minute, the government is attempting once again to move the goalposts right before this decisive final hearing and a potential big win for our clients and Ontarians. We are confident that Ontarians and folks across this country will see through this government's cynical tactics, and we're optimistic that the court will too. To be clear, charter rights don't disappear when a government repeals legislation. The rights guaranteed under the charter exist independently of any legislation, and rest assured, the charter isn't going anywhere, and neither are our clients. While the hearing on the merits will be delayed, this case is very much alive. The 7 youth who brought this charter challenge remain steadfast in their determination to ensure that the ultimate question here, whether the Ford government's actions is fueling the climate crisis, violate a charter right, and that challenge will get its day in court. We will be appearing in court on December 1 to schedule the next phase of this hearing, and we'll be updating the media at the conclusion of the December 1st case management conference. The Ford government's tactics may have bought the government some time, but it will not exempt them from accountability. Our clients and most Ontarians know what is at stake if our politicians continue to fail on the climate crisis. And as their lawyers, we will continue to work tirelessly to ensure that this case continues to move forward and that justice is done. Thank you.
Thank you, Nader. Next, we will hear from Dr. Samantha Green from the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment, or CAPE. CAPE is a national organization that advocates for healthier ecosystems and human health by raising awareness about environmental issues, such as climate change and pollution, and they are also an intervener in this case.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Samantha Green. I'm a family physician in Toronto and the president of the Canadian Association of Physicians for the Environment. As you heard, an intervener in this case. For too long, climate change has been framed as a distant, abstract polar bear problem. But in my experience, it is very clearly a people problem and a today problem. As a physician, I see firsthand that the climate crisis is already harming health, especially among the most vulnerable. In my own practice, I care for young children, older adults, people who are pregnant, people living with chronic illnesses like asthma, heart disease, and diabetes. And for them, extreme heat is not an inconvenience. It is a medical emergency. Evidence before the court in this case shows that hundreds to thousands of lives in Ontario could be at risk from heat waves alone. Rising temperatures are also driving more wildfires, worsening air pollution, and causing floods and storms that displace communities and also threaten access to health and social care. And these harms don't fall equally. People living with chronic illness, people living in poverty, people living in urban heat islands, or without stable shelter bear some of the greatest burdens. Young people who are far more sensitive to certain climate-caused impacts are also disproportionately affected. CAPE has been clear. Climate change is a threat multiplier, deepening existing inequities and exposing those with the fewest resources to the greatest risks. And this crisis is not only about my patients today, it is also about intergenerational health. The decisions our government makes now, today, will determine whether our children and their children inherit a world with clean air, safe drinking water, healthy food systems, and a stable planet. Right now in Ontario, that future is being compromised by politicians who are running away from both the science and their citizens' concerns. Across Ontario, we have seen the Ford government walk back on renewable energy projects, weaken climate targets, cut conservation efforts, and attempt to open protected lands like the Greenbelt to development. Meanwhile, this province is also expanding fossil gas plants, polluting facilities that CAPE and other health experts have repeatedly warned will worsen air quality, increase greenhouse gas emissions, and lock in avoidable health harms for decades. As CAPE has emphasized, climate action is health action, and the most powerful tool we have is prevention. When governments reduce emissions, invest in clean energy, protect natural spaces, and design communities that support active transportation, they are not just fighting climate change. They are preventing illness, reducing healthcare costs, and saving lives today. We need governments that listen to evidence, center public health, and adopt strong, credible climate plans that protect both current and future generations. Our patients and our children are counting on us to act with the urgency this moment demands. Thank you.
Finally, we will hear from Priyanka Vittal, legal counsel at Greenpeace Canada, who will speak to the broader implications of the Ford government's legislative approach.
Thank you. We're standing together here today because the Ford government has decided that the best way to deal with a worsening climate crisis is to stop legislating for it, to stop measuring it, to stop planning for it, and to stop answering to the people who are living through it. This legislative repeal buried deep in the fall economic statement in the hopes that no one would notice it. They've even skirted their responsibility to post it to the Environmental Registry of Ontario, which allows Ontarians to provide feedback on the changes to the law. This is a clear signal yet that this government thinks it can get away with dismantling environmental protection without even having to look Ontarians in the eye and admit what that means for them or allow them to provide feedback on this legislation. A few short months ago, the Premier insisted Ontario was doing its very best to meet its climate targets, but actions definitely speak louder than words. Ontario has little to no climate legislation, let alone environmental protection legislation remaining province-wide. Without legislation that has a real plan with accountability mechanisms, we are speeding down a highway with no map and no exit strategy. How is the government expecting results to magically happen without all of this, without a strategy, accountability, or a plan? Ontario is falling behind on its 2030 goals. We no longer have a cap and trade act. We no longer have renewable energy projects. We no longer have green investment funds legislated for. We cannot rely solely on industry. We cannot rely solely on the federal government. Our province and our provincial government needs to step up and take action. After 8 years in power, we have not seen any real progress when it comes to climate change and environmental protection. It is a deliberate and cowardly decision and choice to try and quietly pass the legislation while Ontarians are grappling with other issues and their other rights being taken away, with housing, transit, education, and healthcare. This decision to have no climate plan has real consequences too. Wildfire smoke is choking our children's lungs while trying to receive reliable healthcare. Seniors and unhoused people are struggling to avoid overheating and blistering heat waves while trying to maintain secure and safe housing. Indigenous communities are losing access to traditional food, medicine, and land while their rights are being taken away. We are losing to climate change what makes our province unique and beautiful: healthy lakes, forests, and our seasons. If this government truly believes that this is all worth sacrificing, then stand up and say it. Don't hide it in a giant omnibus bill, and don't push it through via budget measures that cut our consultation and limit our debate time. It's appalling that the government would choose not to rise to the occasion and create science-based targets, but instead choose to have no plan at all. We see what's happening. We see the choices being made, and young Ontarians deserve better. And Greenpeace Canada intends to fight for the future they deserve, standing alongside the courageous youth challenging the Ford government in court today. Thank you.
That concludes the remarks from our speakers. We'll now open up the floor for any questions that were submitted through the Zoom chat. I'm going to pause for a moment to allow any questions to come in. I'll just start with one question for the youth applicants. Perhaps I'll take it to you, Maddie, first, and then over to Shay to add any additional comments. Does this development change your resolve to see this case through?
Thanks, Julia, for the question. By no means does this development change my resolve. It only continues to strengthen my resolve to continue working on this case. And it's, another moment of feeling let down by my government, which, again, just makes it feel all the more important, not only for myself, but like I said in my what I shared, I'm starting to think about having my own family. And when I think about that, maybe I'll have a child before this case is finished, that it's not only for me, it's for my future children and our grandchildren. And so I'm not stepping down. It's Julia.
Thanks, Maddie. Shay?
Yeah, thanks. I echo what Maddie said, and I would add that, the Ford government has been trying to get this case thrown out at every turn, and we were aware that this was a possible route for them to take, and we were disappointed, as usual, but we're not surprised because it's in line with their record for placing the economy above the very ecosystems that support life. So this new development has as well strengthened my resolve and made me grateful that we are taking action to hold the government accountable in court for their obligation and their responsibility to protect the lands and waters, and in turn, the very people and generations that they're supposed to serve. Thank you.
Thank you, Shay. This one I will put to you, Fraser. Ontario says its emissions have already dropped. It's making significant progress in the fight against climate change. Is it possible these targets are no longer necessary?
Well, first and foremost, I think it's important to note that going forward, there's going to be no way to back up that claim. Because of these amendments, Ontarians won't know what their government is doing on one of the greatest threats to our collective rights in the 21st century. There doesn't need to be a plan, doesn't need to be a target, and there's now zero accountability. Ontario's approach seems to be trust us, yet everything they've done suggests that no one should trust them on climate. Few governments have ever come into office and gutted climate legislation and targets. This government has now done it twice in the last 8 years. So these kinds of bold claims made by the government are exactly why we need legislation that requires the government to report on climate to report on climate progress without any political spin, because the numbers don't lie. In 2018, for example, world's leading scientists said that emissions need to drop by 45% by 2030 if we're to have any chance at avoiding the most catastrophic impacts of climate change. Since that time, Ontario's emissions have stagnated. They needed to drop, and today's emissions levels are almost identical to where they were a decade ago. This government has thrown away almost a decade without any progress at exactly the time when we need action. This is not leading the way, it's putting our province into reverse.
Thank you, Fraser. The next question I'll put to you, Nader. Can you comment on the legal strategy to defeat a likely move by the government to dismiss the case on mootness?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, because I think you put your pulse, your thumb on the pulse of exactly what the government is thinking and what the government is trying to do here. The Court of Appeal made it very clear when they issued their ruling allowing our appeal, essentially concluding that if the government in the area of greenhouse gas emissions, they have to do so in a way that is charter compliant. So that was the holding from the Court of Appeal, and that was the basis upon which the matter now goes back to the courts for a final hearing on the merits. So the government read that Court of Appeal decision narrowly and said, okay, if you don't like our climate targets, if you don't like our climate legislation, we're just not going to have any climate legislation anymore. And now the case is moot. That's the government's argument. Now, firstly, I can't think of a more cynical approach to dealing with one of the greatest challenges humanity is facing. Rather than facing scrutiny and criticism for their inadequate work on this monumental existential challenge, the government says, we want to avoid scrutiny and regulation altogether, so we're just not going to do anything at all. And that is extremely cynical, and that is something Ontarians should be furious about, and we certainly are. It is crass politics and of the most cynical nature. Now, with respect to the question about mootness, our view is that this is not moot. The government's obligation to behave responsibly on climate change, the government's obligation to limit greenhouse gas emissions to safe levels, that exists irregardless of any particular government legislation. That exists as a matter of charter rights of Canadians, and regardless of the appeal of the repeal of this existing legislation, those rights continue to exist. What the government's move has done has forced us, I think, to retool some of our arguments, and this is why there's going to be a bit of a delay in getting to the hearing on the merits, but it is by no means moot by virtue of the government's latest decision.
Thank you, Nader. The question from Jordan Olmsted from Maddie and Shaelyn, and I'll perhaps ask Shay to speak first on this one. You touched on it in your comments, but how have you already seen the climate change impact you and your communities? How have you seen climate change impact you and your communities since this case launched? And for some background details, could you also let us know what cities you're speaking from and how old you are now?
Thank you, Justin, I believe, for the question. So I am currently living in North Bay. I just moved here from where I grew up in Minjikning or Aurelia, Rama area. So I'm 28 years old, and for me, I've seen the devastation from the black ash borers that are being exacerbated from the climate crisis, moving farther north as the weather heats up. And that borer eats the black ash trees, and we make baskets out of those trees. So I just had the opportunity to take part in harvesting the tree and building the baskets. And we are facing that real threat that we might not have these trees to create our baskets from anymore. So things like that and other medicines, the wetlands are drying out in many places. So this really impacts our ability to live on the land as we have always lived here, and to harvest and create in the way that we have always done. So it's impacting everything, our ability to exercise our rights and to live out our cultures and just our way of life. So that's how it's impacted us. And as well, like as was heard before, our communities, especially remote Indigenous communities, are really impacted by wildfires and floods and things like that. So yeah, it impacts every aspect of our lives. Miigwech.
Yeah, thanks for that question. I am living not in North Bay, but near Thunder Bay. I live about an hour out of Thunder Bay, northwest, and I live in a fully off-grid cabin. So I live pretty in line with what's going on with the seasons, which really allows me to really witness what's going on. And I'm 29 now. One of the maybe most Canadian things I can say is that over the span of this case, my ability to play hockey on outdoor rinks has really changed. And I have my hockey gear drying out behind me, and I've had to like find myself in a hockey league because I now am. We just like there were a few winters where we just actually couldn't play outside, and that was really devastating to me. So that's maybe the one thing that really riles me up, and especially not being able to play on the lakes. Playing outdoor rink on a lake is something that I maybe took for granted. And when I think that that's not something that is maybe going to be in our future, really is frightening for me. And I think, yeah, where I live, I just witness it so much. There's moose and bear and wolves. All the animals are living right around me, right outside my front door, and noticing their patterns, and noticing how much longer the bears are up and looking for food, and they're maybe not asleep yet, and I'm really paying attention to that. And lastly, I, within the span of this case, have gone back and got a degree in forestry and am studying forestry and have worked in forestry now across Canada, and have had the privilege of flying in helicopters throughout the Yukon last summer and seeing the span of beetle kill and the forest fires that go on forever really stands out to me. And that's the same in Northern Ontario, but to be looking at it from the air and seeing that, yeah, those are things that keep me up at night, honestly. So that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Maddie. This next question I'll send to Fraser from Anushka Yadav at The Pointer. The Ontario Auditor General is expected to release a new report on December 2nd. Given previous findings that raised concerns about the government's handling of the Environmental Bill of Rights 1993, could this upcoming report have any impact on potentially strengthening the Mathur case?
Well, thanks for the question. We're looking forward to that report and the Auditor General's findings. This case has relied on the Auditor General's reports in the past in building the case and showing that this government is failing to act on the climate crisis. Often in these kinds of cases, you want these kinds of reports to support proving factually that the government is harming rights. In this case, that factual dispute is already settled. The Ontario Superior Court found that it's indisputable that Ontarians are experiencing an increase in the risks to their lives and into health, serious health risks. That's indisputable in the words of the Ontario Superior Court and then affirmed by the Court of Appeal. And further, a settled factual matter is that by not taking steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions further, Ontario is contributing to these risks. That, I think, is part of the reason why the Ford government has taken this unprecedented rollback of accountability. You know, when someone has to change the rules mid-game, it's usually because they're losing. And it's difficult to see what the Ford government has done here as anything other than a clear attempt by them to skirt accountability on their climate record.
Thank you, Fraser. I think that wraps our questions. I'll just pause for a moment to ensure no more are coming in. Thank you all for joining us today and for your continued investment in this precedent-setting case. We've shared a link to a press release in the chat, and we'll circulate this recording to all those who registered. For any additional media inquiries, please do not hesitate to reach out to Kari at Ecojustice, whose email we will drop into the chat as well. Thank you again to all of our speakers and to all of you who attended.